The air was heavy with the scent of old wood and lavender, a lingering fragrance from the sachets Sarah's mother used to tuck into every drawer. The house on Sycamore Drive looked almost exactly as Sarah remembered it from her childhood. A two-story home with pale blue shutters, a cracked concrete path leading to the porch, and a faintly flickering porch light her father always promised to replace, but never did. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. Sarah paused in the entryway, the hardwood floor beneath her feet creaking with the same familiar rhythm. The last time she had been here was for her mother's funeral, 6 months ago. Now, returning to help her father navigate life alone, she couldn't shake the feeling that something about the house had shifted. As she walked through the living room, her eyes traced the familiar spaces: her mother's favorite rocking chair, the shelf of porcelain figurines she wasn't allowed to touch as a child, and the family photos lining the mantel. Yet there was a strange stillness to everything, as though the house was holding its breath. And then there was the hallway. At the far end, past the bathroom and her childhood bedroom, stood the door to the silent room. It hadn't been called that officially, of course. It was a nickname Sarah and her younger brother, Liam, had whispered to each other as children. Their parents had always avoided mentioning the room, treating it as though it were just another unimportant part of the house. But Sarah had always noticed it. The way the door never seemed to open, the way her mother would stiffen slightly if anyone lingered near it for too long. The door was painted the same soft cream color as the others, but something about it always seemed off. Its surface colder to the touch, the way the light never seemed to reflect off its handle. She approached it now, her footsteps slow and measured. The faint sound of the television from the den barely reached her ears, her father likely dozing off in his recliner. The door stood there, quiet and unassuming, yet drawing her attention like a magnet. Sarah reached out, hesitating as her fingers hovered over the brass handle. It was cold, just as she remembered. A shiver ran down her spine as she recalled the silly childhood superstition she and Liam had concocted, that the silent room was a place where ghosts rested, their voices sealed behind the door. "Still locked?" she murmured to herself, attempting to twist the handle. It didn't budge. That night, as she lay in her old bedroom, the silent room crept into her thoughts. She could picture it vividly, though she had never seen its interior. As a child, she once dared to press her ear against the door, holding her breath to listen. She had heard nothing back then, but even now, the memory of doing so made her chest tighten with unease. The following evening, as she cleaned out the upstairs closets, Sarah brought the topic up with her father. "What's in the room at the end of the hall?" she asked, her voice casual but probing. She turned to look at him from her place on the floor, sorting through a box of holiday decorations. Her father, sitting stiffly on the edge of his recliner, looked startled, as though she had asked something deeply inappropriate. "That room?" he echoed. "Nothing, it's just storage." Sarah frowned. "It's been locked for as long as I can remember. I don't think I've ever been inside." "There's nothing in there worth worrying about," her father said quickly, almost too quickly. He coughed and leaned forward, grabbing the TV remote. "Your mother didn't like people going in there, that's all. Best to leave it alone." His tone was clipped, shutting the conversation down entirely. Sarah didn't press further, but the unease she felt only deepened. She noticed how his hand shook slightly as he adjusted the volume on the television. The silent room was more than just a storage space. It held something her father was too afraid to acknowledge. That night, the house groaned and settled, its old beams stretching and creaking in the dark. Sarah woke to the sound of faint rustling, though she couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. As she sat up in bed, heart racing, she noticed a sliver of light in the hallway beneath the door of the silent room. Her throat tightened. She stared at it for a long moment, convincing herself it was just a trick of the moonlight, or her imagination playing games. But as the minutes ticked by, she was sure of one thing. She wasn't imagining it. Something had moved behind that door. And the silent room, so named for its oppressive quiet, no longer seemed so silent after all. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting golden lines across the hardwood floor. The warm light did little to shake the unease that lingered in Sarah's chest. Over breakfast, she tried to push the thought of the silent room to the back of her mind. Her father sat across from her, methodically buttering toast, his focus entirely on the task as if it were the most important thing in the world. "Did you hear anything last night?" Sarah asked casually, stirring her coffee. Her father paused mid-motion, the knife trembling slightly in his hand. "No," he said after a moment, his voice low. "Just the usual creaks. This old house makes noises, you know." His avoidance was palpable, and Sarah felt her frustration grow. "I thought I saw a light in the hallway coming from under the door." At that, her father stiffened. He set the knife down, staring at his plate for a long moment before finally meeting her gaze. "Sarah," he said, his voice firm, "I told you to leave that room alone. It's nothing but memories best left undisturbed." "What kind of memories?" she pressed. But her father didn't answer. Instead, he rose abruptly, muttering something about needing to fix the fence in the backyard. The conversation was over. That evening, with her father absorbed in a baseball game on TV, Sarah decided to investigate. She rummaged through a kitchen drawer until she found a small flashlight and a bobby pin. Her heart raced as she crept down the hallway, stopping in front of the silent room. The brass handle was cold again, colder than it should have been in a house warmed by the evening's heating. She crouched down and worked the bobby pin in the lock, her hands shaking more from anticipation than the difficulty of the task. After a few tense minutes, she heard a soft click. The door creaked open slowly, revealing the room inside. The silent room was small, almost claustrophobic. Dust floated in the flashlight's beam, highlighting every surface layered with neglect. There was a twin-size bed against the far wall, its rusted metal frame sagging under the weight of a stained mattress. An old oak dresser stood to the left, one of its drawers partially open, revealing yellowed fabric inside. A single wooden chair sat by the window, facing out to the overgrown backyard. Sarah stepped inside, her feet crunching on something brittle. She shone her flashlight down and saw shards of glass scattered across the floor, glittering like tiny daggers. The room smelled stale, like something long forgotten. Her attention was drawn to the window. It was covered with thick curtains, but even without pulling them back, she could tell there was no light outside, just shadows. On the dresser, she noticed a framed photograph. She hesitated before picking it up, wiping the dust away with her sleeve. It was an old black and white picture of her grandparents standing stiffly in front of the house. Behind them was a small boy, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, who she didn't recognize. The boy's expression was somber, his eyes hollow. She set the photograph down, her heart thudding in her chest. Turning slowly, she noticed something else, something she hadn't seen at first. Carved into the wooden floor near the bed was a single word: help. As she knelt to examine the carving, a faint creak behind her made her whip around. The chair by the window had shifted, its position slightly askew. Sarah's breath caught. She had been certain it was facing the window when she entered. The flashlight flickered, the beam dimming momentarily before stabilizing. In the oppressive silence, she thought she heard something faint, a whisper. It was indistinct, like the hiss of air escaping a tire, but it sent chills down her spine. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. The whisper stopped, replaced by a low creak as the chair moved again, this time an inch closer to her. She bolted from the room, slamming the door shut behind her. Her heart was hammering as she leaned against the wall, trying to catch her breath. For a moment, she thought she heard muffled footsteps on the other side of the door, pacing slowly back and forth. Over the next few days, the house seemed to turn against her. The sounds at night grew louder. Footsteps, faint tapping, and once what sounded like a child's laughter. Shadows moved just beyond the edge of her vision, darting too quickly for her to confirm what she had seen. Sarah started researching the house's history, combing through old articles and property records at the library. What she found only deepened the mystery. The house had belonged to her grandparents for decades, but before them, it had been owned by a family who had vanished without explanation in the late 1940s. The only detail mentioned in the articles was the strange condition of the house when police investigated. Furniture rearranged, symbols carved into the walls, and a pervasive sense of unease among those who entered. Among the records was a photograph of the missing family. Her stomach churned as she saw the boy from the photo on the dresser, standing solemnly next to his parents. The boy who didn't belong in her family's past. Sarah felt the air around her grow colder as she stared at the picture. The boy's hollow eyes seemed to follow her, his face a haunting echo of the carving in the silent room. Help. The house seemed alive now, its outer wall brimming with an oppressive presence. Sarah felt it every time she passed the silent room. The weight of unseen eyes, the faint whispers that crept just beyond hearing. Sleep became an impossibility. The tapping on the walls at night grew louder, more insistent, and every creak of the floorboards made her heart race. She couldn't ignore it any longer. The silent room wasn't just haunted by the past, it wanted something. Sarah's father grew quieter with each passing day, retreating into a shell of avoidance. Determined to find answers, she returned to the silent room one morning while he was out running errands. This time, she didn't hesitate. With her flashlight in hand, she stepped inside and shut the door behind her. The air was thicker than before, as though the room itself was alive. She opened the oak dresser and began rummaging through the yellowed linens and brittle papers. At the very back of the top drawer, she found them. 3 leather-bound journals, their spines cracked and worn. They were her mother's handwriting, elegant and precise. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened the first journal, the smell of aged paper filling the air. The entries were mundane at first, shopping lists, gardening notes, mentions of family gatherings. But as she flipped further, the tone shifted. Her mother wrote of hearing strange noises in the house, of the feeling that someone or something was watching her. Sarah froze as she read an entry dated 3 months before her mother's death. I heard the boy again last night. He called for help, just like before. John says it's just my imagination, but I know better. The silent room is his prison, and I can't free him. I don't know how. The boy, the one from the photograph. Her heart pounding, Sarah turned to the next entry. The ink was smeared, the handwriting shaky. The whispers are louder. He's growing impatient. I can't go in there anymore. It's too much, too cold, too heavy. I fear what will happen if we don't listen. But John refuses to speak of it. He says we must keep the door closed. Always. That evening, Sarah confronted her father. She placed the journals on the coffee table, her voice sharp and unyielding. Why didn't you tell me about this? She demanded. John Thompson looked at the journals with a mixture of fear and anger. He pushed them aside and shook his head. You shouldn't have gone in there, he said, his voice cracking. You've stirred things up, things we worked so hard to keep quiet. What things? Sarah snapped. The boy, who is he? Why is he in our house? Her father's face darkened. For a long moment, he said nothing, staring at the floor as though the words physically hurt him. Your grandfather, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. He wasn't, well, he struggled with terrible fits of paranoia, hallucinations. My mother, your grandmother, was terrified of him. She believed he was possessed. Sarah recoiled, shaking her head. That doesn't explain the boy. John's eyes filled with tears. When your grandfather's episodes got worse, they locked him in that room. They thought they were protecting the family. But he wasn't alone in there. Her father took a deep, shuddering breath and continued. There was another family that lived here before us. They had a son, a boy who disappeared. The police questioned your grandparents, but there was no evidence to connect them. They were good at keeping secrets, Sarah. Too good. Sarah's mind reeled. You're saying Grandpa? John nodded slowly. They never admitted it, not even to me. But I know what happened. The boy died in that room. And your grandfather, he blamed the boy's spirit for his madness. He claimed the boy wouldn't let him rest, that he could feel him there watching. The words hung in the air like a noose. Sarah's hands shook as she tried to process the weight of the truth. The silent room wasn't just a storage space or a remnant of her family's past. It was a tomb, a place where a child's life had been snuffed out and his cries for help silenced by decades of denial. That night, Sarah couldn't stay away. Armed with her flashlight and the journals, she returned to the silent room, determined to face whatever was inside. As she opened the door, the cold hit her like a physical force. The air inside was frigid, and the faint scent of something rotting lingered. She sat on the floor by the bed, the journals spread out in front of her. I'm here, she said aloud, her voice trembling. I know what happened to you. I'm listening. The room reacted immediately. The temperature plummeted, and the light from her flashlight dimmed. Shadows gathered in the corners, shifting and twisting as though alive. The whispers began again, louder this time, overlapping into a cacophony of desperate voices. One word cut through the chaos, clear and unmistakable. Help. As Sarah clutched the journals to her chest, the shadows surged toward her, enveloping her in darkness. The door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. For the first time in her life, Sarah realized what true silence felt like. the oppressive, suffocating kind that fills a space when every ounce of light and hope has been snuffed out. And somewhere in that silence, she felt the boy's presence. He wasn't just a ghost, he was a wound that had festered, a scar on her family's legacy. And now he wanted her to pay. Sarah awoke on the floor of the silent room, her head throbbing and her body stiff with cold. The journals were scattered around her, their pages fluttering despite the still air. For a moment, she couldn't remember how she had gotten there. Then the events of the previous night came rushing back. The shadows, the whispers, and the suffocating darkness. But now, the room was eerily calm, too calm. She sat up slowly, her breath visible in the frigid air. As she gathered the journals, she noticed something new. One of the drawers in the old oak dresser was slightly ajar. It hadn't been opened before. With trembling hands, she pulled it open to reveal a stack of old, crumbling papers. Among them was a torn notebook page, the writing on it spidery and faint. It was a child's handwriting. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make him angry, I just wanted to play. Please tell my mom I didn't run away." The note was unsigned, but Sarah knew. It was the boy's voice reaching out from the past, desperate and terrified. Her stomach churned as she realized the implications. This wasn't just a ghost's plea for help, it was a record of his last moments. The room grew colder as Sarah held the note, her fingers trembling. The whispers began again, faint and indistinct, but one phrase stood out, repeated over and over, growing louder with each repetition. "Find me." The next morning, Sarah confronted her father again. She showed him the note, her voice trembling with rage and fear. "You knew about this. You've always known." And John's face crumpled, and for the first time he looked truly defeated. "I didn't want to believe it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I told myself it was just my father's madness, that the things he said weren't real." "But they were real," Sarah snapped. "That boy didn't just disappear. He died in this house, in that room." John shook his head, his eyes glassy with unshed tears. "Your grandmother, she couldn't handle it. When the boy went missing, she begged my father to stay silent. She thought if they said nothing, it would all go away. And it never did," Sarah said bitterly. "That room became his prison." John leaned forward, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. "I tried to forget, to pretend it was just an old room, nothing more. But your mother, she couldn't. She felt him, heard him. That's why she kept going back in there. Until she couldn't anymore," Sarah said, the realization hitting her like a punch to the chest. "It broke her, didn't it?" John nodded. "And it's breaking you too." Determined to uncover the full truth, Sarah visited the overgrown backyard that same afternoon. The silent room's window overlooked it, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the boy's story didn't end within the house. Armed with a garden spade, she started digging near the base of the oak tree that had stood there for decades. At first, it seemed like a futile effort. The ground was hard, roots snaking through the soil, but then her spade struck something solid, a metallic clink. Heart pounding, she dug faster, her hands clawing at the dirt when the spade wasn't enough. What she unearthed was small and rusted, a tin box, its lid corroded but intact. Inside was a handful of items, a toy soldier, a small notebook, and a tarnished locket. The locket contained a faded photograph of a young woman holding a child. It had to be the boy's mother. The notebook was filled with sketches, crude drawings of the house, the backyard, and a single figure standing in the doorway of the silent room. The figure's face was scribbled out in every drawing. That night, Sarah returned to the room. She carried the tin box and the journals, as though offering them as proof of her intentions. The moment she stepped inside, the temperature dropped again, and the whispers began anew. "I found your things," she said aloud, her voice trembling. "I know what happened to you." The door slammed shut behind her, and the shadows gathered once more, swirling like a living storm. The whispers grew deafening, overlapping into a roar. But this time, Sarah didn't run. She stood her ground. "Show me," she demanded, her voice cutting through the noise. "If you want me to help, show me what happened." The room seemed to shudder, the walls groaning as though under immense strain. Then everything went still. The darkness coalesced in front of her, forming a shape, a small figure. A boy, his face pale and eyes hollow, stood before her. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Sarah clutched the locket tightly. "I'll help you," she whispered. "I swear." The boy pointed toward the bed, his translucent hand trembling. Beneath the bed, she found an old wooden floorboard that was slightly loose. She pried it up and recoiled as the smell of decay hit her. Inside the hollow space lay the remnants of something small, wrapped in brittle cloth. Her breath hitched as realization dawned. The boy hadn't been taken from the house. He had been hidden here, buried beneath the floor of the room that was meant to silence him forever. The boy's figure began to fade, but his hollow eyes locked onto hers one final time. His lips moved again, forming a single word that echoed in her mind long after he disappeared. Justice. As Sarah sealed the room again, she knew the boy's spirit was no longer trapped. But the house wasn't done with her. It had fed on decades of secrets, lies, and guilt, and its hunger wasn't sated. The silent room might have released its prisoner, but Sarah could feel it watching her now, waiting. And as she stood in the hallway staring at the closed door, she knew one thing with chilling certainty. The house wanted more. The house was quiet, unnervingly so. Sarah stood outside the silent room, the tin box and journals clutched tightly in her arms. She had hoped releasing the boy's spirit would bring peace, that the weight of his tragedy would finally lift from the house. But instead, the silence felt deeper, darker. It wasn't over. Sarah couldn't bring herself to tell her father what she had found beneath the floorboards. He was already so fragile, his denial the only thing holding him together. Instead, she stayed up late that night, poring over her mother's journals, searching for any clue about what to do next. One entry stood out, written just weeks before her mother's death. "I fear the boy isn't the only one bound to this place. There's something older here, something darker. It feeds on pain, on grief. I hear it in the walls, feel it in the shadows. It wants us to stay forever." Sarah closed the journal, her hands trembling. The house wasn't just haunted by the boy's ghost. It was a living entity, fueled by decades of sorrow and secrets. And now that she had opened the door to its darkest corners, it wasn't going to let her go. The following day, Sarah made a decision. She packed a suitcase and told her father they needed to leave. "We can't stay here anymore," she said, her voice firm. "It's not safe." Her father looked at her, his eyes weary but resigned. "You think leaving will make it stop?" he asked quietly. "It's been with us for generations, Sarah. It doesn't matter where we go." But Sarah wasn't convinced. She had to try. As they loaded the car, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching them, its windows dark and accusing. The silent room's door seemed to loom larger than ever, its cold presence filling the hallway like a shadow. Just as she turned to leave, a whisper stopped her in her tracks. It wasn't like the others. This one was soft, pleading. She glanced back at the house, her heart pounding. The whisper came again, clearer this time. "Don't leave." That night, in the safety of a nearby motel, Sarah tried to sleep, but the dreams wouldn't let her. She saw the boy again, his hollow eyes staring at her from the corner of the silent room. He wasn't alone this time. Behind him, shadows shifted and twisted, forming shapes too horrific to comprehend. When she woke, the room was freezing. The lights flickered, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw a figure standing at the foot of her bed, a silhouette, tall and menacing. Then it was gone. Her father's room down the hall was eerily quiet. When she went to check on him, she found him sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. He looked up at her, his face pale. "It's here," he whispered. "It followed us." Realizing they couldn't run, Sarah decided to go back to the house. She knew the only way to end the nightmare was to face it head-on. She returned alone, carrying the tin box, the locket, and her mother's journals like talismans. The house greeted her with an oppressive silence. The air was thick, and every step felt heavier than the last. The silent room's door was ajar, its darkness spilling into the hallway like a living thing. As she entered, the shadows surged forward, engulfing her. The whispers returned, louder and more chaotic than ever, filling her head with pain and fear. She clutched the locket tightly, her voice breaking as she shouted into the void. "I know what you are. You can't keep us here anymore." The shadows recoiled, their movements frenzied. For a moment, she thought it was working. But then a voice boomed through the room, low and guttural, shaking the walls. "You opened the door. You belong to me now." The room erupted into chaos. Objects flew from the dresser, the bed frame rattled violently and the walls groaned as though the house itself was alive. Sarah dropped to her knees, clutching the tin box, and screamed. "Take this!" she shouted, holding the box aloft. Take your memories, your pain, and leave us alone. The shadows hesitated, then swirled around the box like a storm. The air grew colder, sharper, as though the house was draining itself into the object. The whispers faded, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed against her eardrums. Finally, the shadows dissipated. The room fell still. Sarah burned the journals in the box in the backyard that night. She watched the flames consume them, feeling a strange mix of relief and sorrow. The boy's story was over, his spirit finally at rest. But as the fire died down, she couldn't shake the feeling that the house had only retreated, biding its time. She and her father sold the house a month later, moving to a quiet apartment on the other side of town. Life slowly returned to normal, but Sarah could never fully escape the shadows of the past. Every so often, she would wake in the middle of the night, convinced she heard faint whispers just beyond her bedroom door. And in her dreams, she still saw the boy standing at the window of the silent room, watching her leave. The house might have let her go, but some doors, once opened, are never truly closed.